welcome everyone to Rock M Radio. So this is a brand new episode of something Rock M Radio. If you follow this channel on YouTube and you subscribe to the podcast, you will recognize either my face or my voice. My name is Sam Snelling. I am going to be the host for this baseball-centric podcast. If you can believe it, we're going to talk Mizzou baseball. With me I guess your right, is Josh Matejka. He's the deputy site manager. He helps me with everything Rock M Nation. Down on the bottom is my man Kortay Vincent, who has been following and writing about Mizzou baseball for what now? 2 years, 3 years? Is it 3 years?
3 years.
3 years. Josh, Kortay, welcome to the vid/podcast. Josh, what's up with you tonight?
Not much. I've been, I will say and we'll talk about this later, but the whole process of firing a coach and hiring a coach, I feel like has re-energized me to Mizzou baseball. Before Kortay came along, I remember I used to write a little bit more about baseball, and I would do all the season previews and positional previews and everything. And once Kortay came along, I trailed off a little bit and just was apathetic about the program, but I'm excited.
Hands of that a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. It was nice. But no, I'm excited to talk about where Mizzou. I'm glad that we're starting to have the conversation. I think it's a natural kind of inflection point when a coach gets fired and a new one gets hired. But yeah, I'm excited to dive back into the program and see where we go from here.
And so, Kortay, you have been with us for 3 years. You started as a freshman. Now you're the only guy who seems to write about Mizzou baseball. You are as well versed as anybody about Mizzou baseball. Maybe save for Triple Play, who's yes, our site mod, long time baseball fan. He's been around. He's one of the OGs. But your experience covering this team and like the last 3 years, I think exposes you a little bit more than even like the rest of us being on campus. You get to kind of, go to games, be around the players. How is the, general mood around Mizzou baseball, at least in the time that you've been here?
Everyone, I would say the first 2 seasons that I was writing about it, not much of a mood at all. It was more of just like, oh yeah, we have a baseball team. I guess they play on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. This year there was some buzz, which was really nice. Actually, one of my fraternity brothers is a manager on the baseball team. And so we would kind of keep our friends up to date with, the happenings. And people were excited for a little bit, especially after that Tennessee sweep. And then, things changed, and it was I guess the mood went back to the way it was. But there were some positive moments where I felt like I knew people were listening to the radio call when we were beating TCU in Arlington. And so I'd never heard of any students like watching a game unless it was against KU. So there were some positives from this year, I guess.
Steps to some levels of progress. Like Mizzou does sort of have like an up and down, history. Very clearly there's, the national championship that, was well before any of us. But Tim Jamison came in and did a really nice job. Was there for a long time. He, reached quite a few regionals and fielded a competitive team, albeit in a very different league. And so stepping into the SEC, I think, has been a challenge. So they fired Jamison, they hire Steve Bieser. It's not a very popular move among a lot of Mizzou baseball alumni. Is there any explanation for how things went so far south this season other than really just unfortunate injuries? Is there more to it than that?
I think it's hard to say because when you lose 4 crucial arms, that's on an already thin pitching staff, like that's going to have the effect that it clearly had. And then the guys that were good at the beginning of the year, you look at a Franklin or a Maltrud, they just started getting really overused, and then they just didn't have it anymore. And it's like, yeah, you can't expect, to be able to only lean on 3 pitchers when you're playing 4 games a week. That's a setup for failure. I will say that doesn't exactly explain why the offense was so streaky. That they would lose a game like 9-1 and then win 12-10. And it's like that. Sure. That's fine. But it almost felt like if Luke Mann wasn't hitting, then no one was going to. And that isn't really explained by injuries. Would they have made a regional? No, but could they have been more competitive? I definitely think so. I think that this is just an outsider's perspective. I have nothing to really base this on. It did feel a little bit like the injuries kind of deflated the team a little bit, and it took their leader, their captain being like, I'm going to hit 5 home runs this weekend, and you guys just do a little bit as well. We can win some baseball games, for them to like have that mindset. And if that didn't happen, that's when things went poorly. So.
Yeah, and to speak to that too, I even think, Sam, you talked about the season going so far south. I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? I mean, when you look at Steve Bieser's time at Mizzou, he had 1 losing season. That was in 2021. They went 15-36. They were just really, really bad that year. But he was above 500 by a sizable margin also. Every year. Yeah, and the COVID year, and we can talk about that more down the road when we talk about just like what to expect of the program in general, but that seemed to have been the most promising year, and then unfortunately we know what happened. But every single year they were consistently above 500, playing really competitive ball in the non-conference play. But if you look at their conference standings just over the years, that's where it lands, right? They were 4th, 6th, 4th. Nothing happened in the COVID year. And then they finished 7th 3 times in a row in the East. So ultimately it boiled down to, are they competitive in conference play? Which, I mean, the move to the SEC, people talk so much about what it meant for football at the time, but you can't afford to not try and be competitive in football because it's a revenue generating sport. In baseball, it just seems like Mizzou was not prepared for that at all. And so, you can still field a mildly competitive team, but in the SEC, that's just not enough. So they're good, but they were never quite good enough to be competitive.
So do you, and we'll start with you, Josh. I mean, do you think that it was the right decision to fire Steve Bieser? Would you have made that decision?
I think the thing about Bieser that I always really liked is I liked that he had a very practical approach to the job. He was very aware of the limitations of the program and where they were in terms of spending and the conference they were playing in. And Bieser was very upfront about, we have to find the inefficiencies to exploit. He was, I just recently rewatched Moneyball. He was the Moneyball guy, right? He was like, we're going to dig into every advance in analytic. We're going to max out the talent on this roster. And he was really, really upfront about that. And I like that. I like that he was honest and looking to exploit those inefficiencies. However, at some point, if it's just churning out the same results, you may need to find a different tack. Maybe not totally, but maybe a new voice is needed. I remember after the fire was announced, after he was fired, a lot of, honestly, some of his former players were coming out and saying, well, if the school's announcing that they're going to invest more, then why not just give him a chance to use those new resources? And I was thinking, well, it's not as simple as that. Really, Desiree Reed-Francois' job is to analyze, okay, how much are we going to invest in this moving forward? And is he the right guy to utilize those resources?
Right.
Whether or not it's the right move, I mean, we're never really going to, I guess we'll know depending on what Kerrick Jackson does, but I think what it comes down to is he wasn't giving the administration enough reason to keep him around. And ultimately that's what was his downfall.
Yeah, so I would almost kind of call it like the Konzo Martin conundrum. Like very sort of similar. Martin was achieving up until his last year. Really what the investment in the program was, which was mediocre. Had he not had such a dismal final season, chances are like he's giving himself more runway, and perhaps Bieser's downfall was the fact that he could never really get any real traction in conference play. Kortay, what's your take on whether or not Bieser man should have been fired?
I have a much stronger opinion, and I was very happy to see him gone. I actually just wrote about this in a piece about Kerrick Jackson that I think is going to run tomorrow.
Yes.
But
we're recording this on Monday night. So if you're watching this on Tuesday, it is available on the website right now.
This is good audio.
I obviously I'm well aware of the deficiencies when it comes to funding within the baseball program. And we are the I guess the cellar dwellers of spending in the SEC. And that obviously is going to cause some problems, but as Kerrick Jackson pointed out in his press conference today, two of the teams that spent in the top, I think 3 or 4, finished 13th and 14th this year. So it doesn't all come down to that. Even when Ole Miss, this is just a thing that I've really been harping on for the last 2 seasons. Ole Miss won a national championship last year with a bad baseball team. That they weren't very good. They were the last team in the field. They got hot at the right time. Good for them. But like that, you've got up until last year, Ole Miss had never won a national championship. Like there are things I think that go so much more into being a successful baseball program than spending money. And the results that Steve Bieser was churning out, kind of like we were talking about, we weren't getting any better. And it really felt like it was time for change. And really, we'd been kind of regressing. His best teams had a lot of players that Jameson recruited. And so while I was very high on this baseball team at the beginning of the year, and yeah, we might be having an entirely different conversation if Tony Newbeck, Carter Rustad, all those players don't get hurt. But they did, and he didn't really have an answer. And so I was very pleased to see us going in a different direction. And I'm so far liking what I'm hearing from Kerrick Jackson. So
let's talk about Kerrick Jackson. Obviously, anyone who's paying close attention knows the backstory. But for anybody who doesn't, Jackson's a guy who has past history on Mizzou's campus. He was director of scouting and recruitment for Tim Jameson, and has a lot of ties to guys who are still playing professional baseball. He turned around Southern pretty quickly. He was having a successful campaign at Memphis. Not to, I guess, ignore the elephant in the room, he's also the first African-American head baseball coach in SEC history, which in of itself is an achievement. I'm personally a little surprised that it's taken this long, but congrats to him on that. As a admitted non-college baseball fan and someone who only follows casually mostly through Kortay's writing, what do we make of this? I know like the introductory press conference was today. He press conferences to me are like one of those things that it's really hard to come out of that as a loser. if you have any like experience, like actually, dealing with these things. And if you're at the point where you're getting hired by an SEC program, chances are you've had these kinds of things in the past where you have to give a speech. And all you have to do is be pretty good about it, and it seemed like he did a good job. But does that mean that he'll be successful? I don't know. Josh, what was your initial reaction when you heard that he was going to be the guy?
Yeah, I think my initial reaction, I kind of took a very wide angle look at what the hire, kind of how it fit into the context of really Desiree Reed-Francois' career as the athletic director. And it kind of makes a lot of sense to me based on the types of hires she's made thus far. It's a young coach coming from a non-Power 5, Power 6, or whatever sport you're in setting. They're bringing a lot of energy, a lot of promise. They've been kind of climbing the ranks up into that point. Very similar to Drinkwitz, although she wasn't around for Drinkwitz, but she extended him. So I think there's kind of like she buys into that. And then Dennis Gates obviously fits into that as well. I do think that there is very clearly something happening where she's trying to mend some previous relationships, kind of as you alluded to, Sam. The decision to fire Jameson back in, I think, 2016, not necessarily favorably looked at, especially by a lot of alumni, very important alumni for Mizzou Baseball, who, let's be frank, could probably be investing a lot of money into the program if they felt like they were connected to the program. Bringing Jackson in, who I feel like it should be said was just working with Tim Jameson as of last year. Jameson was his pitching coach at Memphis. Really kind of reties that back together, that previous relationship. And I feel like she's trying to mend those fences, which I think is smart. Jackson has a lot of ties to some of the most successful recent years of the program, especially as they transition to the SEC. I know they won the Big 12 in that last year. And I think that in and of itself, and we can get into more of like who Jackson is as a coach in a second, but I think that in and of itself kind of accomplishes two purposes. You get the up and coming guy, which she seems to really like to hire, but then you're also kind of reaching back and trying to rebuild some bridges, as it were, which I think is a really savvy move on her part.
Kortay, initial response to, when you saw the name Kerrick, pop in, what did you think?
Initially, I was somewhat disappointed. I got to be honest. I have come around to the idea much more, which is a lot about what I wrote about. I was hoping they'd kind of take a big swing and go for a guy like Rob Childress. Lived in the postseason, knows what it takes to win in the SEC. He has that experience. But again, kind of like Josh said, that's not really a DRF hire. That's not no matter what people on Twitter or fan message boards are saying, like, oh, we need this guy. Like, DRF's going to go get someone from probably a smaller school that's shown that they can do more with less. And that's kind of been her MO when it comes to hiring. And the more that I've looked into it, and after his introductory press conference today, you mentioned that you can't really lose a press conference, which is totally true. But I think he hit it out of the park. I think, like, I actually sent Karen a message on Slack, and I was like, this guy is awesome. I'm ready to run through a brick wall for him already. I just think that he has a lot of unique experience in terms of he was a scout. He did the draft league. He's proven that he can take a poor baseball program and at least inject some life into it on 2 occasions now. I mean, the SWAC is not the SEC, but to go from 9 wins to 32, a conference title and a regional berth, I'm not saying that's going to happen for Mizzou. I think it's going to be a much longer process. But that shows that I think that he mentioned culture a lot in his press conference. And I think that at least in these situations and as prior jobs, players bought in. And I think on top of that, I really liked it more because it didn't feel it did feel like to Jackson, this is a really good job. And to a guy like Rob Childress, it's probably a stepping stone to getting back to a place where he can make the College World Series, right? But for Kerrick Jackson, he seemed to actually be like, no, I want to be a part of the resurgence of Missouri baseball, and I'm not going to use this as a stepping stone. Like, this is a place that's home to me. You know, he's from St. Louis, Kirkwood grad, like has experience with the program, and so all of that and listening to the press conference, I'm very on board with the hire at this point.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as you both sort of spoke about like the process that DRF seems to sort of go through and the types of men that she hires, at least men in the two prominent hires that she's made. I honestly don't know enough about the volleyball coach. She hired the soccer coach too, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I believe so. I believe that was last year, 2 years ago. But yeah, I think she had the soccer coach. Larissa was already here. She was hired by Stirk. I will always stand on and just say, like, going through the whole COVID thing, like, completely disrupted my own instincts on like how long ago something happened. Because like there's this like total block of like 2 to 3 years where I just don't really remember like when something happened in that timeline. But you do sort of recognize, like the benefits of Dennis Gates of having significant high major experience, having experience as a recruiter at a high major, but then going to and Cleveland State is not is a big spender actually for the Horizon League. But again, like, and I think this is one of those things where you brought up his Jackson's experience at Southern, and one of the things I think is important is like those are lower on the economic scale, as compared to the SEC. Like you're talking about, way different budgets, and if you're at a place like that, the difference between like the top school and the bottom school in the athletic budget is not a lot. Whereas in the SEC, like there is a wide gap between, and granted, Vanderbilt spends probably as much, if not more, than anybody in the country. But it's, essentially they're head and shoulders above in comparison to kind of like what Alabama spends for football in comparison to the rest of, the SEC. So coming in, he is going to be faced with a larger disparity. And so you're really going to have to rely upon scouting and development. And this is one of the things that I think, tying back into Dennis Gates, was Dennis Gates, his ability to identify undervalued recruits, get those guys in, develop them, and turn them into pros. And I think when you're talking about the path forward for Mizzou baseball, Josh, you mentioned kind of Moneyball. It's a similar thing where you want somebody who's going to be able to identify an undervalued recruit, get them on campus, develop them, and turn them into a pro.
Yeah, but like similar to the Moneyball concept, right? I mean, that stuff's all well and good, but if you're not bringing in talent that's optimized for your system, I mean, it's very much like football. Like if you're not bringing a talent that's optimized for your system, it's not going to work, right? Steve Bieser really squeezed all the talent that he had out of that roster. But in the end, it kind of came back to what Kortay was saying, where, a few guys went down. That happens to a lot of teams. And if Luke Mann wasn't hitting, nothing was happening. You have to be able to develop some sort of depth to where there are people that can come in and pick up the slack whenever the main guy or the main few guys are down. And that just happens a lot in baseball. It's a big team, big roster that you have to work through and you have to develop. The thing that really strikes me about Jackson when you go through his career, and Kortay, you mentioned this, he worked for the draft league for 2 years as the president of the draft league. He was a professional scout for the Nationals for a few years. He really was a scout in that time where the Nationals were drafting and developing a lot of the guys that would end up helping them to be really successful in the postseason in those early 2010s and the mid 2010s. Well, he was known as, he was the recruiting coordinator for Missouri, like you mentioned. He worked for the Boris agency as a talent evaluator. A lot of his background is in talent evaluation and scouting. And I mean, it seems really kind of 101, but if you're going to be a program like Missouri and you're not going to spend as much money as Vanderbilt and Tennessee and all these other schools, you have to nail your scouts. You absolutely cannot miss on guys. You can't just be putting out a suboptimal team. Otherwise, the very best you're going to get is kind of what we saw with Bieser, right? You're going to get teams that max out a few games above 500, but are never really that competitive in conference play. So all of the Moneyball stuff, all the let's make your swing speed higher, let's make your exit velocities better, let's get the spin rate on your pitches better. That's all well and good, but if you don't have guys that can max out to that, like that MLB level, or even just like that are going to go play pro somehow, you're just going to end up playing kind of mediocre college ball, which I think Missouri is tired of based on the fact that they decided to go in a different direction.
Yeah, and I think when you're giving sort of a new guy the helm, and they are they have stepped up, paying him a little bit more based upon the USA Today column that I quoted in my sort of first piece, where I spoke about whether Mizzou needed to decide if it wanted to be a baseball school or not. Like Kerrick Jackson's set to make, I think we had the contract at about $750K a year, which is, a significant bump up for what, Steve Bieser was making, which I believe was under 500,000. And I've always been of the belief that it's not necessarily how much you spend. It's what you spend on where. And I think that there are a lot of, head coaches throughout college football, college basketball, college baseball who are making significant money. And maybe there needs to be a larger, more broad investment in the support level of the staff. And that was one of the big things for me when they made the hire of Dennis Gates, is they expanded. Conza Martin's staff was, basically like 9 people, and Gates has 12. So that's just 3 more bodies where you can start assigning out roles. And I'm just trying to sort of envision a scenario where Missouri can position itself more of like the Kentucky football of SEC baseball. Does that make sense? Where you don't have to be Georgia, you don't have to be Alabama, but can you be consistently good? Can you make a regional every other year? Can you have one year where maybe, I'm thinking of a couple of years ago when Kentucky hit 10 wins and everyone was you finished the year in the top 25. And if you do that consistently enough, then you can start reinvesting the money that you're generating off of that back into the program. And I think it's ridiculous to think about it now, but Mark Stoops is making $8.5 million a year coaching Kentucky football. So if you take a long enough timeline, is Kerrick Jackson the right kind of guy that can build that level of consistency at Mizzou? And really, again, whether or not you want to call it a baseball school or not, I don't think that's necessarily important. But can you, I guess, make Mizzou less forgettable in the sport? And I feel like that's where you have to start. And maybe that sounds dismissive, and I don't mean it to be, but I don't what are we thinking is the steps to the goal here? And I'll ask Kortay, since you were the Josh was the last to talk.
I think that's totally doable with Jackson. I like I said, am very on board. He's shown the ability to rebuild a program, like Josh mentioned as well. He's clearly got some proficiency when it comes to talent evaluation. And the thing is, if you're the 10th best SEC baseball team, you might be a 2 seed in a regional. Like, we don't need to shoot for the stars. We just need to be the last team not in Hoover. And that team has got a puncher's chance at a regional at a minimum. It might even be a lock. I mean, so if Mizzou was to get to the point where they were consistently the 9th or 10th best SEC baseball team, I would think that's a major success. They've been in the 11 to 13-ish range for what feels like most of Steve Bieser's tenure. And I think Jackson, I mean, I haven't seen him coach a baseball game. I'm doing everything based on like, oh, this is what he did at Southern and Memphis. But all indications to me are that he wants this job. He wants to bring us back to prominence, and it's not for, to boost his career. He wants to see Mizzou on the national scene. And I don't see why there's any reason they couldn't be. And I think baseball is one of the unique sports where this is possible, to not necessarily spend like everyone else and find success. I mean, you look, Auburn, I forget who it was. They got bounced by the 4th seed in their regional. Oral Roberts took it to Oklahoma State. I know more about this because I played against a lot of those kids in high school, but Oral Roberts took it to Oklahoma State for the 3rd time in like 4 weeks. They're going to the super regionals, and yeah, that's a historically really good baseball program that wins their conference every single year, makes a regional every single year. But when you look at the investment that a program like Oklahoma State's putting in there, and then you see a school like Oral Roberts, dominate them 3 times. That there are schools that, it's possible to succeed while not spending a ton of money. And I think that Kerrick Jackson has shown that he at least has some sort of aptitude to do that. So why can't it happen?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about the economic side and we talk about the level of investment, I've never, thought that, because Mizzou has historically just not been a school that has a lot of money to throw around. They're not Alabama. They're not Georgia. They're not Tennessee. They're not even Arkansas. Like, these are all schools that literally will just throw money at a problem and hope it sorts itself out. And I don't think you have to be, I really don't think you have to try to compete with those teams in the way that they spend. What you need to do, and again, the majority of my experience in following Mizzou sports has always been basketball. What you do is you have to make sure that you're better than the bottom. And Mizzou, for a lot of years in the SEC in basketball, and this is also true of baseball, is they just haven't been better than the bottom. When you lose that many consecutive games to Ole Miss, and you lose that many consecutive games to Mississippi State, and I know, baseball is different than basketball, but these are my basketball analogies. Then what's going to happen is those programs aren't spending the same amount as you are. You have to beat those teams, and Missouri has to find a way to consistently beat the bottom of the conference. And if you're beating the bottom of the conference, next thing you know, like, all of a sudden your record looks a lot better, because you don't have to go, sweep Tennessee. You just got to take one. You don't have to go sweep the teams that are, like Vanderbilt. You don't have to sweep them in order to, make your voice heard. Maybe you just steal one series against like the top sort of 4 level seeds, and then you're firmly planted in the middle. And as you were saying, like that's going to get you a lot in the postseason. And so when we talk about like what we want to see from this baseball program, I don't think Missouri is ever going to be in a position where they're building $50 million facilities for their baseball team. But can it be better? Can there be more? And I think if you're looking at what they're spending on football and what they're paying their football coach to be basically mediocre so far, now they're doing the same thing with basketball. And look, this past year was a lot of fun. They're slightly above mediocre, right? Like that's kind of what you have to be in order to land in the NCAA tournament. Softball is kind of taking a little bit of a step back. And, again, it's a tough league, but is Missouri baseball enough of a priority for the Mizzou athletic administration to where they're willing to? And look, I think Mizzou's budget last year was $2.5 million. Doubling that would put them in the middle of the SEC in spending. Like, is that doable?
Yeah, I mean, especially kind of going back to a point I made earlier, if you're going to start trying to develop those, or like at least cultivate those relationships with, I would say, notable, famous alumni who may not be connected with the program anymore. I mean, how much let's just throw a name out. How much is Max Scherzer making per year with the Mets? Is he up to 50? I think he's above 40.
I think like 43.
You're telling me Max Scherzer can't just write a check off, get a tax credit for writing Mizzou a $2 million check? Like, I mean, he's not going to if he feels like there's no way that he has any say in the program, or if he's like at least can't make his voice heard within the department. I mean, here's the thing: we're talking about spending as if it is like the end all be all. Our friend Matt Central put out a tweet the other night, kind of totaling the SEC expenses in the past 5 years for all SEC baseball programs. Mizzou is obviously last by a fairly wide margin. Tennessee, who we're holding up as this example, this shining example of like, look at what they're doing. They've got Tony Vitello. There's the guy we should have hired. They're so great. They're 11th in spending over the past 5 years. They're not throwing like so many millions. I think they're only $6 million above Mizzou over the past 5 years.
Their investment is more recent. They've been spending a lot more money recently than they were like pre-Vitello. They were closer to Missouri and have since taken off.
Yeah, and that's fair, but like, even like, I mean, all of that money, it's not like you just throw all that money and it happens right away, right? Some of that previous, I would say, administration's lack of investment is still felt throughout the program. Like, you can still have like splash moments without just like throwing a bunch of money at the problem. To me, there are some natural disadvantages that Mizzou baseball has within the SEC. A lot of people joke about the weather, but that is a problem. Like, you're not going to be able to outslug teams when the first half of your season is being played near freezing weather sometimes. So you're not going to be able to build a dome, right? A lot of people make that joke. Oh, let's build a dome. You're not going to be able to build a dome. You can, however, invest money. I would say start putting money toward potential NIL deals and bumping the recruiting staff a little bit so that you can start recruiting to the strengths of your program. To me, Mizzou is only ever going to be successful if their pitching staff is lights out. I mean, you look back at the best years of Mizzou baseball, they always had great pitchers. I think they really need to get back to making sure they're locking down that talent, not only in state, although there's a lot of in-state talent, but also making sure that they're recruiting well and that they're recruiting correctly to their natural kind of geographical place within the SEC. Can you do facilities improvements? Absolutely. They should definitely do some facilities improvements. It was funny when Jackson was doing his presser today, the picture from the background was like just the backdrop in that like weird little room, and you could see like the fire extinguisher on the side. Someone at Rock M pointed that out. but like they don't have this like huge facility to celebrate the new baseball coach. So just like do some like aesthetic stuff, like make it look nice, make it feel nicer, but be strategic about how you're investing, because even those little bits can help, and you can make up some of those fine margins.
So yeah, I wanted to play around with this a little bit. Because I pulled all this data. Anyone that's been following Rock Nation for last few years knows that we like to go in and just pull all this interesting school spending data. This is from 2021 and the previous 5 years. So you can see, basically. Vandy is at the top, 2021, and all the top 5 are schools that would probably not surprise you. Maybe Ole Miss being that high. There's Tennessee in 2021 spending $6 million. But this is, I put this out on Twitter also. This same chart, and it kind of gets away from you if you scroll in this thing here. So we'll just click here, but. This is, again, all budgets for the last 5 years, and you can see the last 5 spots are all Mizzou. And look, but this is kind of what I'm talking about when I say, like, you don't need to go crazy. Like, you don't need to spend $9 million a year. But if you're spending 5, like, look at how much farther up the list you get.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're competing with LSU. You're competing with Auburn. 2 much more historically good baseball programs. And so why can't Mizzou take what is, it's still a significant portion of the budget, but is it worth that to like wean away from other programs that are maybe generating more money, like men's basketball and football? Like we know the deficit that Mizzou football is already sort of working with. Is Missouri going to see enough of a revenue increase by investing into baseball, or is this throwing money down the toilet and just not being able to generate? Like, I don't know. And I think like this is one of the reasons why I'm happy that Kortay is on this pod, because he can probably tell us better than others. Like, if Mizzou is consistently good, are fans going to show up? Like, and what needs to happen at Taylor Stadium to make the fan experience better, and to make sure that people are coming out? Like, what needs to happen in order to make this type of investment worthwhile?
I have one idea that I have been saying for a couple of years that I think Taylor Stadium needs to immediately make to get more students out there. But I don't know if there would be the, ROI on that, that we would hope there would be. I think we'd see a better baseball program, obviously, but I don't know that it's going to. Even if you sold out Taylor Stadium every single game, you're not going to make that much money, which is an unfortunate situation. It's a small ballpark. It's not. DRF made it sound pretty clear in her post presser interview that it was like new stadium is not in the cards right now. And I think a good example of why I think that's actually reasonable, kind of like Josh was talking about, Tennessee. Yes, they've spent a little more money recently since Vitale has, really kicked it into gear with those guys, but Lindsey Nelson isn't very nice either. It's also cold. It's also not a great ballpark. You look at it on TV and you're like, eh. Like, yeah, they have really, really good baseball players there recently, and that draws fans and, people want to watch them on TV. But I think it was either yesterday or this morning, they announced like a huge investment. We're going to totally redo the stadium, like all this stuff. We're going to have these super crazy suites. And it's like, okay, there's your investment. But even for them, basically, they've had to go to back-to-back super regionals, have the best college baseball team I've ever seen assembled. And then they were like, we're going to build a new stadium. So, maybe the first step is investing more so that we see more wins, so that we think it's worth investing even more. Maybe, let's take a hit to see if we can make more money later kind of situation. But I think this is just an aside kind of about getting more fans there. Many SEC or Big 12, the Southern schools, they have some sort of area in the outfield where college kids can bring their own coolers and pack their own beer and go watch baseball. And if Mizzou did that, we would have so many more people at games. I think that, like, it sounds really stupid, but if college kids could do that, there would be way more students at games. I know I went to the Vanderbilt game with 4 of my friends. 2 of them left in the 7th inning in a 4-3 game because they were just like, it's kind of cold. Like, we just want to go to the bar. Like, and if we gave people like a situation where it was more of like a community, like obviously it's not going to be Ole Miss where they've got all the fraternity guys burning couches and throwing their beers in the air for every home run. But you could definitely encourage more kids to go to baseball games. And I think getting the students there is the first step to getting more fans there, because they're the people that are close and easy to get as opposed to, other fans.
Yeah. And I mean, the fan experience, I think, is something that DRF has shown that she's pretty invested in learning about throughout her time at Mizzou. She's talked a lot about building experience at basketball games and at football games. And I do think you're right, Kortay. Like, I mean, it's great to say, let's just throw $6 million at the problem and watch what happens. But ultimately, like, to assure that you're going to get some sort of return on investment, you need to show that you can at least do something with the talent that's on the bench and behind the bench and stuff like that. And so I think the hope is that Kerrick Jackson will have at least some increased success, and that will inject some life into the program. And then you can start investing a little bit more. But I mean, going back to how we started this conversation, what is the culture of Mizzou baseball right now? There's not one. I mean, when I look at football and basketball, especially basketball right now, I can tell you what Mizzou basketball is about. I can tell you generally what Mizzou football is about. Mizzou baseball, I'm just like, Steve Bieser really tried to do some interesting stuff, and, it's cold. There's no really coherent way to say it. So however that needs to happen, whether that's Jackson really investing and getting to know the fans, whether that's the RF making some strategic investments, whether that's some big donor gifts. I don't know how it needs to happen, but there does need to be some kind of culture shift within the program, I think, before you can really start to talk about, okay, we're going to really flip our budget and turn it up a notch here. I think before that happens, I think you're throwing money at the problem without really any sound strategy.
Well, and we've talked a lot about Tennessee, and like it sucks to say, because like Vitello was supposed to be our guy, right? And, they figured it out, and they're the blueprint. I think Kendall Rogers tweeted about like that Mizzou needs to follow the Tennessee blueprint. Like, you got to get a coach to inject some energy, and then, hopefully the results follow. And they very much Tennessee baseball, cool. Like Todd Helton 25 years ago. What else does anyone know about Tennessee baseball between Todd Helton and Tony Vitello? But they have an identity under Vitello. It's that FU attitude, right? Like, we're going to bat flip, we're going to hit tanks, and we're going to kind of be arrogant and have some swag. And like, I think you're totally right. Mizzou baseball needs something that gives the players an identity, that gives the fans something that they want to be a part of. Like, there needs to be something there that says this is Mizzou baseball.
Yeah, and I'll say this too. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole either. But the whole thing about Taylor Stadium, I get it. It's not it's not up in the upper echelon of SEC stadiums. Missouri in general, I think, is a pretty pro baseball state. A lot of people here like baseball from the Kansas City and the St. Louis sides. A lot of those people meet in Columbia. So the culture of baseball exists here. I mean, people here are used to going to baseball games when it's kind of cold outside. I'm a baseball crazy person. I have no problem going to a baseball game when it's cold outside. Do facility upgrades need to happen? Absolutely. But I would go watch a really exciting baseball team, like a good baseball team that was fun to watch if it was cold outside. This whole idea that, it's Taylor Stadium is bad and the weather's bad, so I'm not going to go watch baseball. If your team is good, I think people are going to come, right? I mean, that's the field of dreams rule. But like, you just need to have at least a modicum more of a success than Bieser did, and then you can start talking about like, what are the bigger steps we need to take?
Yes.
Yeah, and I would say like the bigger thing when it comes to that sort of like level of program building and fan excitement it's a level of competitiveness, and kind of going back to like the cons of Martin Dennis Gates, like Martin's big failure in his last year was like how uncompetitive that team was, and on most nights. Did they win some games down the stretch? Yeah, but for the most part, that team was just not competitive. And this last year, there were just so many blowout losses, and it's deflating as like the most casual fan ever. It's deflating for me to just look at the box score and be like, 10-1, really, guys? Like, can we at least do something to be a little bit more competitive? And I think like that's probably the lesson. I think the unspoken thing here, that we've referenced but we haven't really gone into, is like NIL. I don't know how. I know that there's a strong collective for basketball. I know there's a strong collective for football. There's virtually no collective at this point for Mizzou Baseball. That needs to change. I don't know what sort of NIL opportunities you need for higher level baseball players, but you need something. I can't even imagine a guy like Luke Mann floating around Columbia and doesn't have some sort of endorsement deal, just with any local business, just making something. And I think like that needs to change also. Facility upgrades will help recruiting visits, but ultimately it's up to Kerrick Jackson to sort of instill the culture and to make it a better, warmer, place where guys want to show up. Kortay, you have any final thoughts you want to throw in before we wrap this up?
Not particularly. No, I think we covered it all pretty well. I will say it was nice to talk baseball with you guys. That I will say that, I was cracking a joke with my parents before this. It was like, yeah, we're talking baseball for the first time. It took 3 years, but here we go. And I enjoyed it. So thank you for having me on, guys.
Josh, any final thoughts?
I'm pretty disappointed. I bet the over on how many times Sam would use a basketball analogy to talk about baseball, and you only did twice. And I was looking for, I think my over under was 3.5.
Oh,
yeah,
I would have guessed way higher actually.
Well, you were pretty controlled, so I'm proud of you. I think, like I said at the beginning, I'm actually this is a really good inflection point for a lot of people like me who have probably been a little bit more invested in the past. And then kind of there was a little bit of apathy set in to be more invested in the program moving forward. I think Jackson is a really kind of, again, the stuff we talked about. I think Jackson is an exciting hire. He's shown a lot of success in the places that he's been. And I think he does a lot of the things that you need to do well to win at Missouri. Good talent evaluator. Seems like he's able to inject life into a program. I'm really curious to see kind of how those notable alumni get brought back in. I think we've maybe seen a hint of it in the fact that Tim Jameson's about to go into the Hall of Fame less than 10 years after his kind of unceremonious firing. I think it's notable to point that out. I think there's reason to be excited about what it looks like moving forward, but certainly that this being a non-revenue sport makes it more challenging. So, we'll see. I think there's a good foundation. A lot of people still remember when Mizzou was really good at baseball, and I don't think it's far-fetched to say that Kerrick Jackson could get him back there, and maybe not like in 1 or 2 years, but I think 3 or 4 years is a pretty reasonable expectation.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for hopping on this podcast. I don't know what like the future for like Rock M Radio, like what it holds. I would like to see more of the rest of our team. I think part of my hesitation to even do this podcast is I don't pretend to be an expert on baseball. So I've tried to bring on people who knew what they were talking about more than I do. I would like to see more baseball podcasts. You guys are welcome to show up. Let me know if you want to do that. We can do that. Probably won't be a whole lot to talk about right away. But we're all excited for Kerrick Jackson and what he can bring to Mizzou. So be on the lookout for some potential, and I'm sure at some point we'll come up with a more creative name than just the baseball pod.
Mad Max's Thunderdome.
I was thinking, I was jokingly gonna say like first episode of Diamond Dogs, but that's a little too much Ted Lasso for everybody.
Oh, but it's still like a great show.
But Diamond, right? Anyway, so thanks everybody for tuning in. We are a proud partner of the Fan First Sports Network. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more of it beamed directly into your personal devices, click on the subscribe button below. You can find this podcast through Apple Podcasts, app for iPhone, the Google Podcasts, app for Android, or whatever app you use to listen to your podcast on your mobile device. You can also find Rock On Radio on Spotify. So that's it for us. Maybe we'll see these gentlemen again, hopefully in the future and soon. Guys, thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks for listening, y'all.
Thank you.